State, Revolution, and Self-Determination by Werner Bonefeld. Quote, "All emancipation is the restoration of the human world and of human relationships to man himself." End quote. Marx. Communism is the theoretical and practical anticipation of the society of the free and equal, the complete emancipation of man, of human emancipation. Footnote. Man, in quotes, with a capital M, is used here and throughout to mean Mensch. End of footnote. It is a society worthy of man, a society where man is no longer a dominated, exploited, and debased being that is condemned to function as a mere human resource in the accumulation of abstract wealth for accumulation's sake. Communism is a society where man exists as a purpose and not as an exploitable resource. Communism does not denote abstract equality before the law, before money, before the state. Communism is rather the emancipation of man from abstract equality, and as such, an emancipation, it declares that the social individual receives according to her needs, and that each social individual contributes according to her ability. Communism, then, is the practical critique of the domination of man over man. The society of the free and equal summons the idea of the, quote, community of free individuals, carrying out their work with the means of production in common, end quote. Marx. Communism is not the transformation of a society into a single office and a single factory where everybody becomes a laborer, as Lenin proposed in his State and Revolution. Does the proletariat need what Lenin extolled? Factory discipline. Would this really be what the community of freely associated man would decide for themselves in freedom from coercion? Communism and factory discipline are mutually exclusive, and their proposed extension in the name of the proletariat is shameful. As Marx saw it, quote, to be a productive laborer is not a piece of luck, but a misfortune, end quote. The idea that communism entails the generalization of this misfortune in the form of the worker state is grotesque. It projects the capitalist subsumption of all and everything to the dictate of economic rationality as communism, and adds that communism is different from capitalism because communism replaces the market by a centrally planned regulation of the political economy of labor. Communism is not social reproduction through humans. Communism is social reproduction for humans, for and by themselves according to their needs. Communism, then, does not stand for the nationalization of industry. Communism stands for the socialization of the means of production. That is, their transformation into means of emancipation, means which are controlled and applied by man himself in full possession of his own existence as the subject. The free association of individuals and the form of the state are mutually exclusive. Free association, baby. Woo! Communism entails the abolition of all forms of power over and above the human individual. Communism, in short, stands for human emancipation. And because communism stands for human emancipation, communism is a critique of political emancipation of the state. As Marx argued, quote, all emancipation is a return of the human world and human relationships to humans themselves. Political emancipation is the reduction of man, on the one hand, to a member of bourgeois society, an egoistic and independent individual, on the other hand, to a citizen of the state, a moral person. Not until the real individual man has taken the abstract citizen back into himself, and as an individual man has become a species being in his empirical life, in his individual work and individual relationships, not until man recognizes and organizes his, quote, forces propres, don't know what that means, something French, as social forces, and thus no longer separates social forces from himself in the form of political forces. Not until then will human emancipation be completed. The society of the free and equal does, in short, not entail the liberation of man through the state, but the emancipation of man from the state. The state's abolition by the freely associated producers organizing their own human world. Political emancipation denotes the existence of the social individual as an individualized individual. Did I say end quote? God damn it. Now I'm getting confused. Anyway. Political emancipation denotes the existence of the social individual as an individualized individual endowed with abstract rights. These abstract rights are those of atomized market individuals who are all equal before the law despite their inequality in property. The divorce, then, of labor from the means of production entails the emancipation of the political from society. The form of the state, thus, is the, quote, concentration of bourgeois society, end quote, Marx. The form of the state's purpose is to guarantee and secure the inequality in property through the subsumption of the individualized individual under the law of abstract equality. This, then, is the subordination of social relations to the law of private property. That is, equality, freedom, and Bentham. The treatment of all as equals before the law characterizes the form of the state as a, quote, illusory community. Illusory community. Did I say community with an R? Fuck. It treats the real existing individual as constituted, quote, character masks or, quote, personifications of capital, and espouses the interest that is common to all character masks, their universal existence for each other as a resource, as a utility, the so-called republic of the market. The form of state, then, is adequate to its content, to guarantee and protect the enslavement of labor as a mere human factor of production that is sold and exchanged on the market, and once contracted, made to work, quote, under the command of capital, end quote. Marx. The capitalist freedom of labor from the means of production entails that the products of labor appear to have mastery over instead of being controlled by man. The freedom of labor from the means of production entails the freedom of the products of labor from the social individual, and that is the subordination of social labor to the world of things it itself creates. The political emancipation of the political in the form of the state, its abstraction from society, entails its content of upholding the rights of contract, the form of bourgeois freedom. The freedom of capitalist exchange relations presupposes the exploitation of labor, and this exploitation presupposes the divorce of labor from the means of production, rendering social labor a mere commodity that is bought and put to use. The form of the state thus indicates formal freedom and formal equality, the content of which is the, quote, perpetuation of the laborer, end quote. The, quote, sine qua non of the existence of capital, end quote. Marx. In short, the exploitation of man by man and the domination of man over man are inseparable, as each is the condition of the other. Communism means the return to man of all that which appears to exist separate from man. Communism demands, then, social autonomy, and that is social self-determination. Quote, the reality, das Bestehende, that communism creates is precisely the real, verliche, doesn't matter, basis for rendering it impossible that any reality should. I'm going to reread that whole thing. So I'm trying to read the German, but I can't. The quote, the reality that communism creates is precisely the real basis for rendering it impossible that any reality should exist independently of individuals, insofar as this reality is only a product of the preceding intercourse of the individuals themselves. End quote. Marx and Engels. In short, quote, revolutions are not made by laws, end quote. Nor are they made by or through the state. The Leninist espousal of the state as the vehicle of social revolution confuses social autonomy with the autonomy of the state, and by doing so, the Leninist espousal affirms the essence of Jesus Christ. The Leninist espousal of the state as the vehicle of social revolution confuses social autonomy with the autonomy of the state, and by doing so, it affirms the essence of the state, that is, the emancipation of the political from society, the content of which is the subsumption of human purposeful activity to relations of abstract equality, an equality that denies human dignity. It treats everybody, regardless of need, as abstract individuals endowed with formally equal rights. Section 2. Coffee sip time. Communism, quote, communism is the real movement of the working class, end quote, Marx. Lenin's statement in State and Revolution that the proletarian state is a bourgeois state without bourgeoisie was apt. The bourgeoisie was abolished. The relations of private property were changed, but the mode of production remained in the form of state capitalism. Insofar as revolutions leave the material basis of society untouched, and indeed aim to bring forth, quote, industrialization, and that is, quote, capitalization, by means of state-led expropriation and economic planning, revolutionary change amounts merely to a political revolution, a change of political class. Capital, as Marx argued, is, quote, the separation of the conditions of production from the laborer, end quote. The nationalization of the means of production does not provide an alternative to capitalism, because the nationalization of the means of production does not overcome the divorce of social labor from the means of production. The nationalization of the means of production merely focuses this divorce in the form of the state. Marx's conception of communism as a classless society is turned upside down in Leninism. Society consists of only one class, the working class. As Lenin put it, quote, the whole of society will have to become a single office and a single factory with equality of labor and equality of pay, end quote. The factory discipline of the capitalist enterprise is to be, quote, extended to the whole of society, end quote. The worker state has to control, quote, corrupted workers, and has to, quote, assert control over idlers, end quote. And, quote, serious punishment, end quote, has to be imposed to secure compliance. However, as Lenin argued, quote, the necessity to observe the uncomplicated basic rules of all human intercourse will soon become a habit. And then the door will be opened wide, end quote, for the transition from communism's first stage to its second, where the state withers away. The internalization, in other words, of the capitalist factory discipline as a social habit is endorsed as the prerequisite for the withering away of the state. The idea of society as a centrally planned factory and of humans as socialized factors of production whose ability to think and dream is expropriated and replaced by the internalization of command, mirrors and reinforces the capitalist existence of human social practice as a mere personification of exchange relations. The idea that social emancipation can be effected through the workers' state, and the understanding of communism as the emancipation of man as the subject are mutually exclusive. The former is based on the economy of labor, and the latter on the freedom of society to control its own affairs. Marx saw the society of the free and equal anticipated in the, quote, community of revolutionary proletarians, who extend their own control over the conditions of their own existence and those of all members of society. It is as individuals that the individuals participate in it. It is exactly this combination of individuals, assuming the advanced stage of modern productive forces, of course, which puts the conditions of the free development and movement of individuals under their control. Conditions which were previously abandoned to chance and had assumed an independent existence over and against the separate individuals, precisely because of their separation as individuals. End quote. Marx. In other words, Marx saw communism as the real movement of human self-determination. For humans to enter into relationships with one another, not as separated individuals whose social existence is made manifest behind their backs through the value form, but as social individuals, as human dignities who are in control of their social conditions, the economic, quote, mastery of capital over man, end quote, has to be abolished so that man's social reproduction is, quote, controlled by him. I really liked that one quote, that one word choice he used, human dignities, to describe a person. Not like dignities we have, but like a person in and of themselves being a dignity. Little personal commentary. What needs to be overcome, then, is the alienation of human social practice from her conditions. It is this alienation that constitutes the relationship between wage labor and capital. What functions are left for the state in a society that is in possession of itself and organizes its social reproduction on the basis of the equality of needs? What social basis does it have in a society where the realm of necessity is cooperatively organized by the associated producers themselves through the realm of freedom? Footnote. Quote, in fact, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations ceases. Thus, in the very nature of things, it lies beyond the sphere of actual material production. Freedom in this field can only consist in socialized man, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing their interchange with nature under their common control instead of being ruled by the blind forces of nature. But it nonetheless still remains a realm of necessity, because it begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom forth only with this realm of necessity as its basis. End quote. Marx. See the useful exchange between Wildcat and John Holloway for an assessment. End of footnote. The revolutionizing of the relations of oppression fails if the means of revolution do not anticipate the purpose of social revolution. Human emancipation. The ends have to be anticipated in the means. Without this, the means merely accommodate to those same conditions which ostensibly social revolution sets out to abolish. Social revolutions that accommodate their organizational means and methods to existing relations of oppression and divorce the goal of revolution from the organizational means, rendering them an end in themselves, merely perfect the machinery of the state in the name of the proletariat. Lenin proclaimed that the workers would be participating in equal measure in the administration of industry and state, and demanded their subordination to the Communist Party because it was the party which gives expression to their most urgent and sovereign will. In short, he argues that each individual is able to perform both advanced and mundane functions in recognition of and subordinated to a most superior authority, the party. The proletariat, then, functions as a party worker in all aspects of its life practice. The proletariat then functions as a party worker in all aspects of its life practice. It does not figure as the essence of revolution, and that is, it is not endorsed as a revolutionary subject that is seized by the recognition of its own social power to leave behind all relations of oppression. Communism cannot be decreed, nor is communism government on behalf of the people. Communism is not an advanced system of the political economy of labor. Communism is the self-activity of the social individuals who determine their affairs themselves as autonomous social subjects. Slaves, as Marcuse put it, quote, have to be free for their liberation so that they are able to become free, end quote. In other words, the society of the free and equal has already to be present in the consciousness and practice of the dependent masses and has to achieve material existence in the revolutionary movement itself. In short, the purpose of social revolution, i.e., human emancipation, has to be effected in the revolutionary means themselves, and that is, the content of revolution has to be reflected in, better, has to be constitutive of, the organizational means. The means of emancipation are most crucial. Lenin's 1902 notion that revolutionary consciousness has to be brought to the masses from without because the working class, by its own efforts, is able only to develop trade union, i.e., economic consciousness, justifies the idea of the Revolutionary Party as the tribune of the people. As such a tribune, the party is conceived as a committee of professional revolutionaries that direct the masses. Direct and revolutionary organization are thus with necessity seen to be mutually exclusive, since the masses are presumed to be unable to determine themselves. Democracy would merely undermine the revolutionary efforts of the party, subjecting the party to, quote, economist demands that emasculate the leadership role of the Revolutionary Party. Since the workers are deemed incapable of revolutionary consciousness, the party, through its directorship over the working class, is charged with educating the mass in revolutionary discipline and spirit so that it transforms into a class for itself. Who, however, educates the revolutionaries? For what purpose do workers have to be educated? Lenin's answer is communism. Our task, he argues, quote, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from its spontaneous trade unionist striving and to bring it under the wing of the revolutionary social democrats, end quote. There is no need here to rehash Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Lenin. Suffice to say that she saw spontaneity not as a, quote, instinctive action, in contrast to conscious direction. She saw spontaneity as the driving force, not only of the revolution, but of the vanguard leadership itself, keeping it left. Her assessment of Lenin as a Blanquist, who operating conspirationally, No, I feel like I would say conspiratorially, but that's not the word that's here, but I think that's the word that's trying to be said. I'll say it, I'll reread the sentence using my word. Her assessment of Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg's assessment of Lenin, as a Blanquist who, operating conspiratorially, has no need for mass action except on the day of revolution itself, is apt. In Leninism, the means are turned against the ends. The critique of spontaneity is for the Leninist and any other self-declared revolutionary vanguard self-serving. It mirrors the critique of spontaneity. The critique of spontaneity is for the Leninist and any other self-declared revolutionary vanguard self-serving. It mirrors the bourgeois prejudice of the dependent masses on an ill-educated crowd that has to be led by, quote, responsible leaders, so that it fulfills its historical function to achieve communism. However, communism is not the creator of class consciousness. Rather, communism grows out of it. In short, the idea of the party as the vanguard that directs and educates the masses for communism denies that communism is the movement of the working class. The Leninist supposition of the immaturity of the working class, rather than justifying the idea of the, quote, revolutionary party, justifies instead the existence of the party as an end in itself. Would this not imply that the party is the most powerful check on the real movement of communism, the working class? The idea of the revolutionary party is a contradiction in terms. The basic idea of the revolutionary party is that the working class is incapable of emancipating itself or making revolution, and that it therefore cannot do without a party of professional revolutionaries. How might the revolutionary party be able to seize power? The answer is through a mass uprising. Will the revolutionary party get anywhere without the masses? The answer is self-evident. For the revolutionary party to succeed, it depends on the masses, their ingenuity and purpose of action. What role, however, is left for the revolutionary party once the masses have taken charge of themselves? Will it become part of the masses and so abandon its leadership? Or will it, leadership in quotes, or will it proclaim its leadership over the revolutionary masses? How can this be done when the masses persist in their effort to achieve self-determination? The conflict, then, between the revolution and the old regime transforms into a conflict between the masses and the party. Although its own, quote, revolutionary success depends on the revolutionary activity of the masses, this activity threatens the leadership role of the party and is thus deemed a factor of disorder and anarchy. The party, in sum, has to catch up with the revolutionary masses, haul them in, and once power has been seized, re-educate and discipline them to, quote, create socialism on their behalf. According to this view, the working class has to be taught to be emancipated. Education implies the supervision of the working class so as to secure the working class's compliance with the laws of emancipation as conceived by the Revolutionary Party. In other words, the masses are allowed to be free as the party decrees and not as the masses determine. Any attempt at freedom of self-determination on the part of the dependent masses is seen, with necessity, as a counter-revolutionary threat. The party leads because the dependent masses are immature and infected by bourgeois prejudices. Any assertion of independence of action on the part of the masses is thus judged with necessity as a threat to the leadership of the party and thus the revolution itself. The equation of revolution with the leadership of the party then means that, in the name of revolution, the party has to use all available methods and means to maintain strictest control over the masses, whose consciousness is deemed either petty or bourgeois, i.e., economistic, and once power has been seized, subversive and potentially counter-revolutionary. Socialism, Marx once argued, is, quote, the revolution in permanence, the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary transitional period towards the abolition of all classes, end quote. Can this permanent revolution be announced by the party and the party's state? If it were, how can the permanent revolution progress without calling into question the party and its state? Or is it directed by the party and its state? If it is, whom does it revolutionize? Marx conceived of permanent revolution in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat. What is meant by the class dictatorship of the proletariat? Trotsky, who is famously credited with the idea of permanent revolution, provided one answer. The Revolutionary Soviet of Kronstadt, 1921, did not manifest permanent revolution, but instead a counter-revolution that had to be annihilated and its participants to be, quote, shot like pheasants, end quote. Trotsky, as indeed they were. As Brendel, Cajo Brendel, in this volume shows, Kronstadt 1921 entered the mythology of the Bolshevik state. The so-called counter-revolution was defeated, allowing the consolidation of the Bolsheviki and the Republic of Commandeered Labor. On the day that the Central Committee announced the NEP, the New Economic Policy, and commemorated the Paris Commune of 1871, Kronstadt fell. From the perspective of the party's seizure of power, is that true? Hold on. Did that really happen, that the Central Committee announced the New Economic Policy, commemorated the Paris Commune of 1871, and ended Kronstadt on the same day? If that's true, that's fucking insane. From the perspective of the party's seizure of power, this murderous elimination of the permanent revolution in action makes sense. It freed the so-called worker state from the self-organization of the proletariat, securing its existence over and above the social individual. Historically, political revolutions have never transformed the mode of production. Political revolutions change the form of state, perfect the state's machinery, and replace one political class by another. As Marx argued in the 18th Brumaire, all political upheavals have perfected the state instead of smashing it. There is no doubt that, quote, political upheavals are quite incapable of realizing the, quote, society of the free and equal. See Johannes Agnoli. The fall of Kronstadt eliminated the organizational forms of social self-determination, i.e. the Soviets, and incorporated them as administrative organs into the structure of power, strengthening the conception of socialism as, quote, socialist organization plus electrification, end quote. That's Lenin. This concept emulated in practice the Taylorist division of labor and affirmed that the so-called worker state entailed the standardization of social life based on a centrally planned economy of labor. The idea of society as a huge centrally directed factory entailed the, quote, introjection of capitalist norms of efficiency, labor discipline, industry, and accumulation, end quote. Dyer Witheford. He just put out a new book from Monthly Review on capital. Might buy that shit. The conception of socialism as a centrally planned economy of labor characterized the idea and practice of the, quote, Revolutionary Party. From its inception, the division between the directing party and the directed masses. The smashing of Kronstadt 1921 suppressed the revolution for self-organization, and that is social autonomy, in favor of a conception of socialism not as an alternative, but as a competitor with capitalism. Section 3, quote, in a fearsome world, it is a question of learning hope, end quote. Ernst Bloch. Marx talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat on only a few occasions. Yet it was this term upon which the Marxist-Leninist tradition built a whole legitimating edifice. Dictatorship is usually, and correctly so, used to describe a state in the state of siege. In Leninism, the term stands for the, quote, socialist organization of society by the party and its state. Marx's few references to the dictatorship of the proletariat refer to it as the dictatorship of the proletariat as a class, the mass of society. Millions of people cannot all be dictators concentrated in the form of the state. That's a good sentence. I like that. I'm going to reread that a couple of times for myself. Millions of people cannot all be dictators concentrated in the form of the state. Millions of people cannot all be dictators concentrated in the form of the state. Such a dictatorship, by its very nature, is limited to a small number of people. Is this Leninist conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat what Marx had in mind? If he had, that would be bad for Marx. Godelier, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Godelier. I think it's Maurice Godelier, blah, reported that there is nothing in Marx that would suggest that he advocated, quote, state or bureaucratic power against the working masses, end quote. Marx did not argue that the proletariat had to be educated by its, quote, own dictatorship to acquire factory discipline. Indeed, as Godelier continues, quote, dictatorship of the people was not to be turned against the people, but against the enemies of the people, against the representatives of the old exploiting classes who were opposing revolutionary transformations of the society with arms and other means. End quote. It was then not to be a party dictatorship on behalf of, and that is, over the working class. It was conceived as a dictatorship of the majority of the people against the minority, that is, those who own the means of production and whose interests, the interests of bourgeois society, are concentrated in the form of the state. The dictatorship of the proletariat, then, relates to the revolutionary struggle for the democracy of the freely associated cooperative producers. Whether this phase will succeed depends on whether the means of production are socialized, leading to their control by associated labor, or whether the counter-revolution triumphs. The dictatorship of the proletariat appears, then, to refer to the struggle of social autonomy against existing relations of constituted power. Quote, above all, we must avoid postulating, quote, society, again as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. The individual is social being, end quote. Marx. Simply put, capitalism cannot be overcome by a change in command, but only by the abolition of the commanding. Or like that. I'm going to reread that. Simply put, capitalism cannot be overcome by a change in command, but only by the abolition of the commanding. Instead of the seizure of power, it means the abolition of power, not after, but during the revolution itself. The first step in this abolition, as Marx and Engels argued in the Communist Manifesto, is the struggle for democracy by the working class. How can the equation of the dictatorship of the proletariat with democracy be understood? The espousal of the state as the vehicle for the society of the free and equal confuses human emancipation with the emancipation of the state from society. The idea of the, quote, social republic means the social subordination of society to the state. The idea of the state as the agent of the dictatorship of the proletariat means the forceful subordination of society to the authority of the state. The idea that society is to be set free through the state, as Leninism and with it all vanguard notions of liberation teach, accepts the state as if it were a, quote, independent being which possesses its own intellectual, ethical, and libertarian basis, end quote. Marx. Lenin's rejection of the capitalist state and his affirmation of the proletarian dictatorship through the state seems to imply that the state is a capitalist state only because it is run by the bourgeoisie, and that once state power has been seized by the vanguard, the state becomes an instrument of emancipation. Marx's notion of the state as the, quote, organized violence of the enslavement of labor, end quote, is thus not denied by Lenin. Organized violence is to be perpetuated by the worker state to realize the proletarianization of society, extending the factory discipline to the whole of society. The project of human emancipation and the seizure of political power are mutually exclusive. The state cannot be used for the purpose of human emancipation. The project of human emancipation has to be reflected in and must inform the means of revolutionary transformation itself. In terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat, this would mean the extension of democracy to the whole of society. In short, the dictatorship of the proletariat stands for the democratic self-organization of society in and through the negation of the state. The dictatorship of the proletariat, in this view, does not assume the form of the state. It is, in fact, the negation of the state. Marx's assessment of the Paris Commune is explicit on this. The Commune was, quote, the negation of all state power, end quote, and amounted to a revolution against the state. It was the organizational form through which society restores to itself its own social life. The Commune did not entail a revolutionary transformation of the state, transferring power from one political class to another political class. Rather, the Commune was a revolution which smashed the political form of class domination, i.e., the state. It replaced, in other words, the organized power of subordination by its own power, creating its own self-determined forms of social organization. The Commune, then, was the organized social counterpower, and as such the political form of social emancipation. Instead of seeking, quote, salvation through the state, the Commune stands for the autonomy of society, society's self-determination and self-organization, in opposition to the state during the revolutionary struggle against the bourgeoisie, whose concentrated force is the state. The state, then, is neither the agent nor the instrument of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Rather, as Marx argued, it is the state that requires to be educated by the masses. What function is left to the state once this education has run its course? Marx saw the Commune as the, quote, most human means, end quote, of revolutionary struggle for social self-determination, and this at a point of transition, that is, during the intense battle between the forces of revolution and violent counter-revolution. The Commune anticipated, in its revolutionary means and methods, the purpose of human emancipation. The Commune began the, quote, emancipation of labor, end quote. However, it was not the society of the free and equal. It was the organizational means of social self-determination during the revolutionary uprising itself. The Commune, in short, set the elements of a new society into freedom during the revolutionary struggle. Marx called this phase of the revolutionary process the dictatorship of the proletariat, and he argued that, in relation to the Commune, this dictatorship reflected in its means the purpose of social revolution. In short, Marx's assessment of the Commune shows the dictatorship of the proletariat in a different light, the practical negation of the state in and through the democratic self-organization of society, a democracy of the social majority, and as such, a democracy that begins, in opposition to existing relations of oppression, the emancipation of labor. Every revolution can only develop and mature the germs which already exist and have made their way into the consciousness of man. Revolutions cannot themselves create these germs or generate new worlds out of nothing. The society of the associated producers is not something that communism invents or creates. If communism is indeed seen as something that invents itself, then Engels' notion of communism as, quote, humanity's leap from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, end quote, is apt. Leninism rests on this conception of communism as a leap. It is created by the party as the theoretical guardian and organizational expression of working class consciousness. Lenin's idea that the masses are by themselves incapable of revolutionary consciousness denies the possibility of revolution as social self-determination, and instead confirms that revolutionary change can only be brought about from above, forcing, as it were, the working class to leap into communism. The means of emancipation have to be adequate to their purpose. If the means merely mirror existing relations of power, then nothing new is born. Rather than man creating his own social organizations and forms of social reproduction, power is seized but not abolished, and the capitalist means of production are nationalized, and the economy of labor is imposed on society to create the new socialist man, a man of standardized issue. Marx did not conceive of the, quote, realm of freedom as the result of an historical leap. Rather, communism was seen as the movement of the working class within and against the capitalist social relations themselves. In short, communism grows out of the class struggle. Human emancipation cannot be imposed. Human emancipation develops through conflict, and this conflict organizes, based on a history of experience of struggle, its own organizational forms of self-determination in opposition to the existing relations of exploitation and domination. The constituted relations of power are the foundations upon and against which the struggle for human emancipation rests. The organizational form of human emancipation then develops within the womb of existing society and are shaped by the existing society. Marx's insistence that the dictatorship of the proletariat is a period of transition, that is, a period of struggle between new and the old, between social self-determination and the relations of constituted power, recognizes that the new society grows out of the old society on the basis of a permanent class struggle that counterposes, in its organizational means, the revolutionary ends of human emancipation to the existing relations of human indignity. In sum, revolutions cannot be made by decrees. Revolutions can neither be announced by a central committee, nor can they be directed by it. The project of human emancipation grows up within existing relations of power, develops through conflict against them, and either goes beyond them or is cut back only to start anew. Force, quote, force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with the new one, end quote. Marx. Marx adds, quote, Marx adds, quote, it is itself an economic power, quote, force. Force is itself an economic power, end quote. Class struggle is the, quote, logical and historical presupposition for the existence of individual capitalists and workers, end quote. And, quote, the basis on which exploitation, end quote, rests. Simon Clark. Capitalist social relations rest on and develop through class struggle. Capital has to exploit labor in order to reproduce itself. Quote, fanatically bent on making value expand itself. The personified capitalist ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake, end quote, increasing the, quote, mass of human beings exploited by him, end quote. Marx. Class struggle is constitutive of capital's expanded reproduction, and it is the force through which the new is born. The Leninist idea of the party as the director of class struggle casts the party in the role of the midwife. However, the midwife is herself not struggling to be born. This is not the role of the midwife. Once that which has been born, screams, John Holloway, the midwife is redundant unless the midwife is adamant that that which is born is not to be allowed to be set free. Human emancipation has to do with an external Leninist midwife. Its realization depends on the self-determining power in the sense of potentia or vermogen of the dependent masses. It depends on their power of self-determination through organizational means that posit the emancipatory goal of the classless society as the organizational principle of the means themselves. As Maddock reports, quote, the workers who committed themselves to the Revolutionary Council argued for dictatorship because for them, the Revolutionary Councils amounted to the dictatorship of the proletariat. They opposed Lenin not because Lenin demanded dictatorship, but because Lenin demanded the dictatorship of the party, end quote. In Leninism, the means are turned against the end. Instead of social self-determination, the education of the proletariat by the dictatorship of the, quote, revolutionary party led, not as a distortion, but as a confirmation of the idea of socialism as an advanced system of the economy of labor, to the forced industrialization that under Stalin constituted nothing less than a version of, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote. C. Dyer Witherford, 1999. Section 4. Quote, thinking means venturing beyond, end quote. Ernst Bloch. It's Ernst Bloch. Right? Communism means the emancipation of labor from all abstractions that rule over the social individual. Communism does not mean the emancipation from labor, nor does it mean the liberation of labor from the anarchy of the market through means of central economic planning. In every society, all production is appropriation of nature, and appropriation means exchange with nature through labor. Labor is necessary. The question is not the necessity of labor. The question is, rather, the form of the social organization of this necessity of labor. Quote, Really free labor, example, composing, is at the same time the most damned seriousness, the most intense exertion. The work of material production can achieve this character only, 1, when its social character is posited, 2, when it is of a scientific and at the same time general character, not merely human exertion as a specifically harnessed natural force, but exerted as a subject, which appears in the production process not in a merely natural, spontaneous form, but as an activity regulating all forces of nature. End quote. Marx. In short, the emancipation of labor amounts to the social autonomy of labor, organizing its own affairs. Its social character of self-determined practice, its existence as a subject. The social appropriation of man's life forces means that these are returned to man, bringing them under the control of the freely associated cooperative producers. In Marxism-Leninism, this appropriation is understood in merely judicial terms. It does not advocate the transformation of the means of production into the means of emancipation, but rather the means of production's expropriation by the state. It projects the transfer of the property rights from capitalist owners to state ownership. It is then not the social individual who is in control of the means of production, but the party bureaucracy and its state. The separation of the original producers from the means of production is not abolished. It is merely focused. State socialism amounts to a rebellion against the anarchy of the market, whose unpredictable development is to be overcome through the state-organized extension of the capitalist factory discipline to society at large. Socialism, then, as Lenin argued, is, quote, nothing else than state capitalist monopoly, which is applied for the benefit of the whole people and which therefore ceases to be capitalist monopoly, end quote. The destructive character of capital is thus only one of degree, and therefore correctable through the combination of capitalist work discipline and with socialist organization. The problem, then, with capitalism is not the exploitation of labor founded on labor's divorce from the means of production. The problem is rather the lack of effective and efficient organization, which is seen to derive from the competitive, that is, the self-destructive market relations based on private property. The socialist transformation of capitalist money into state capitalist monopoly is seen to replace capital's destructive market forces by the rational administration of economic relations. Footnote. The idea of the state as economic planner does not derive from Marx, but from Hegel. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel argued that in the progress of reason, all is ultimately subsumed into the state. Although Hegel did not argue that private property was to be subsumed in the state, the socialist idea of the state as the organizer and planner of society poses Hegel's idea of the progress of reason with more logical force than Hegel himself. On Lenin's misconception of economic relations, see Diethard Behrens in this volume. This organization of social production requires central leadership and bureaucratization. It cannot do without. Leadership is thus not only a question of the conquest of power, it is the presupposition of Leninism in its entirety. Trotsky's statement that the, quote, crisis of the world is a crisis of leadership, end quote, quoted in Dunyevskaya's 1986, is therefore apt. Regardless of whether Trotsky would have been a better leader than Stalin, the focus on leadership mirrors the idea of the business leader of laissez-faire capitalism, adopts it as the organizational means of revolution, and transposes it to so-called worker state. Revolutionary leadership was required because, as Lenin argued, class consciousness, quote, can be brought to the workers only from without. That is, from outside the economic struggle, from outside the sphere of relations between workers and employers, end quote. The idea, then, of subordinating the workers to themselves in the form of the workers' state represents an rests. The idea, then, of subordinating the workers to themselves in the form of the workers' state rests on distrust of the workers, who on their own are merely able to develop, at best, economic consciousness. Hence, his claim that the party had to, quote, bring political knowledge to the workers, end quote. Trotsky's idea of crisis as a crisis of leadership merely echoes Lenin's concerns. The masses must be made free by force, and their education, an education for liberty, must not hesitate to use compulsion and violence against those on whose behalf the party leads. Yeah, I think I gotta take a break. That's part one. Alright, I'm back. The argument of the historical backwardness of the proletariat does not wash. It presupposes that against the background of existing conditions of misery, the project of emancipation has with necessity to be one of party leadership, a leadership which assumes the directorship of the class struggle, both against existing powers and against backward workers, educating backward workers in political consciousness and directing their efforts. The concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a form of educational dictatorship rests theoretically on a tradition which spans from Plato to Rousseau. It is, as Herbert Marcuse argued, easy to ridicule this position, but much more different to contradict it. This is so because, without hypocrisy, it acknowledges those same conditions which prevent human self-determination. The argument then rests on the so-called objective character of existing conditions, and by accepting the objectivity of capitalist conditions, reinforces their objective force. Marx's idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat teaches the state a lesson, replacing the artificial state, but nonetheless, Marx's idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat teaches the state a lesson, replacing the artificial but nonetheless powerful sovereignty of the state by the true sovereignty of the social individuals organizing their own social reproduction, is thus turned on its head. The idea of the education of the masses in socialism, in quotes, not only acknowledges the conditions which prevent social self-determination, it also mirrors these conditions in the revolutionary means and projects them onto the new society, perverting the revolutionary ends. Against the background of existing conditions of human indignity, the Leninist idea of leadership appears persuasive. The demand for human self-determination appears to summon romantic illusions, rendering Leninism credible by default. What, however, is to be understood by objective conditions? Orthodox Marxism argues that because of its position in the production process, the working class is the only revolutionary class. However, this position is itself a, quote, objective condition. The working class exists in itself, and in order to realize its potential as a revolutionary class, has to be transformed into a class for itself. This transformation requires leadership, in quotes. The notion, quote, in itself refers to capitalist social relations as constituted relations, and that is, as relations where human social practice subsists as if it were a mere personification of things themselves. Thus, quote, in itself refers to the established existence of capital, its constituted Dasein. Orthodox accounts, then, employ the notions in itself and for itself to indicate the, quote, objective position of the working class and the working class's potential as a revolutionary class, quote, class for itself. Leaving aside the Leninist instrumentalization of this dualism in the form of the leadership role of the party, Marx's answer to the classical question of epistemology is unambiguous. Quote, the separation between in itself and for itself, the substance of the subject, is abstract mysticism. End quote. Marx. Footnote. On Leninism's roots in pre-Marxian methodology, see the contributions by Behrens, Clark, and Rook in this volume. The quotation from Marx has been translated by the author. Furthermore, the dualism between objectivity and subjectivity does not make sense when looked at through the lens of Marx's critique of fetishism. His critique shows that human practice exists for itself as a perverted practice in the form of capitalist social relations, and he argued that all social relations are essentially practical. His critique reveals that the constituted forms of capital are, in fact, forms in and through which human practice, quote, exists. Quote, in itself as relations between things whose constituted form is the separation of social practice from social practice's conditions, and for itself because human social relations subsist in and through the relations between things. Better, these relations acquire a livelihood as perverted forms of existence of capitalistically constituted human social relations. A world of things that is reproduced by quote, active humanity in and through her class-divided social practice. It follows that human social practice subsists also, quote, against itself, as on the one hand a perverted social category, and on the other as a power that makes history and is thus capable of leaving behind her own perverted existence. Human practice, then, exists in itself, for itself, and against itself in the form of capital. The dualist conception of objectivity in itself and subjectivity for itself belongs firmly to a tradition of thought that rests an understanding of our social world as a world made by man and a world dependent upon man's transformative power. The treatment of class as existing in itself leads to an accommodation to objective conditions. That is, it leads to affirmative accounts of a perverted world. In short, as Horkheimer reports, the separation of, quote, genesis from, quote, existence constitutes the blind spot of dogmatic thought. The presupposition of this separation merely leads to the critical acceptance of, quote, objective conditions, from which human social practice is derived and upon which strategic calculations for the conduct of class struggle are based. In contrast, Marx's critique of fetishism does not affirm objective conditions. Marx's critique of fetishism dissolves objective conditions as conditions that subsist in and through human social practice, however perverted this practice might be in the form of capital. In other words, the Leninist idea of leadership mirrors the perverted world that it ostensibly sets out to dissolve. Mirrors provide reflection, which, however fractured, do not provide projections of the not, quote, not yet, Ernst Bloch, that exist in perverted form within the constituted relations of capital as its constitutive power, human cooperation in and through and against the perverted form of value. Pace, the orthodox affirmation of objective conditions. The critique of political economy is charged with providing enlightenment as to the true constitution of the world of things. Enlightenment is a thoroughly subversive business. It doubts that things are what they appear to be, and it thinks the world upside down in order to reveal its essence. The human being that exists against itself as the producer of its own forsaken condition, and for itself as the not yet existing subject that relates to herself in dignity, and that is, exists for itself as a purpose and not as a resource. The presupposition of capitalist social production is the freedom of labor from her conditions. This presupposition informs and informs the real movement of capitalist social relations. Capital, quote, fanatically bent on making value expand itself, end quote, Marx, can do no other than to intensify the division of labor so as to increase the division of labor's productive power. There is no doubt that the, quote, subdivision of labor is the assassination of a people, end quote. Urquhart quoted in Marx. Yet it merely consolidates the, quote, original separation of labor from its conditions through further and further fragmentations of the social labor process dismembering man. Still, however much social labor is fragmented, divided, and subdivided, human cooperation remains, quote, the fundamental form of the capitalist mode of production, end quote, Marx. This cooperation exists against itself in the value form that integrates the, quote, assassination of a people, end quote, with the respectful forms of equal and free exchange relations. Human cooperation, then, as to be liberated from its antagonistic link with the capitalist organization of social reproduction. Labor, quote, is and remains the presupposition, end quote, of capital. Capital cannot liberate itself from labor. Capital depends on the imposition of necessary labor. The constituent side of surplus labor upon the world's working classes. It has to deposit necessary labor at the same time at which it has to reduce socially necessary labor to the utmost in order to increase surplus value. This reduction develops labor's productive power at the same time the real possibility of the realm of freedom. The circumstance that less and less socially necessary labor time is required to produce, for want of a better expression, the necessities of life, limits the realm of necessity, and so allows the blossoming of what Marx characterized as the realm of freedom. Within capitalist society, this contradiction can be contained only through force, including not only the destruction of productive capacities, unemployment, worsening conditions, and widespread poverty, but also the destruction of human life through war, ecological disaster, famine, the burning of land, poisoning of water, devastation of communities, and the creation of new profitable opportunities such as the production of babies for profit. The usage of the human body is a commodity to be exchanged and operated on. The industrialization of human production through cloning, etc. The existence of man as a degraded, exploited, debased, forsaken, and enslaved being shows that capitalist production is not production for humans. It is production through humans. In other words, the value form represents not just an abstraction from the real social individual. It is an abstraction that is true in practice. Quote, true in practice, end quote, Marx. Value abstracts from the human being and reduces her to a mere personification of her own life practice. The universal reduction of all specific human social practice to the one, some abstract form of labor, from the battlefield to the cloning laboratory, indicates that the separation which began with primitive accumulation appears now in biotechnical determination to expropriate human beings. This misery is unworthy of man. It demands revolutionary transformation. Paraphrasing Marcuse, the human being is a thinking being, and if thought is the sight of truth, then the human being has to possess the freedom to be led by thought in order to realize what is recognized as truth, namely that human social practice itself is constitutive of a world which enslaves it. Marx saw the appearance of workers' cooperatives and workers-owned factories as both direct and indirect signs that the transition to communism had already begun. He saw in the struggle for a shorter working week, however contradictory, the results for wage labor as, quote, the basic prerequisite, end quote, for human emancipation. Further, he showed that the contradictory force of cooperation, quote, not only have we here an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperation, but the creation of a new power, namely the collective power of the masses." End quote. He argued that the capitalist struggle to contain labor as a resource for the accumulation of abstract wealth contains the tendency towards a, quote, "monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied and its product. Labor no longer appears so much to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as a watchman and regulator to the production process itself. The laborer steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor." End quote. Marx. Further, quote, "Nature builds no machines, no locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc. These are the products of human industry. Natural material transformed into organs of the human will over nature or of participating in nature. They are," quote, sorry, there's no quote here. Why did I say quote at all? "These products of human industry are organs of the human brain created by the human hand, the power of knowledge objectified. The development of fixed capital in the means of production, for anybody who doesn't know. Well, not capital in the means of production. Capital in the means of production that leaks its value into several production periods over time. Not in one go, like a machine is fixed capital. The development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced, not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice of the real life process." End quote. Marx. In other words, although condemned as a mere factor of production, living labor organizes production, and it does so by transforming its life practice into a watchman and regulator invested with general intellectual human knowledge and intellectual power. The transformation concerning contemporary relations entails a crisis-ridden reduction of necessary labor in and through unemployed workers and unemployed capital. Capital in the form of money is employed because it exists in excess to the reproductive requirements of expanded accumulation. There develops then a credit superstructure, an abstraction from surplus value production, where money is made out of money. Money prime. At the same time as money's quest for self-expansion depends on the exploitation of labor. Money production, money prime. This divorce between productive accumulation and monetary accumulation is with necessity intensely crisis-ridden and violent in its command. It entails a mortgage on the future exploitation of labor. A mortgage which, as every crash or financial crisis indicates, is destructive of human life. The limit of capital is capital itself. In order to posit itself through expanded accumulation, capital has to contain human productive power through the destruction of means of production on the altar of money, sacrificing workers on the pyramids of accumulation. Monetary panic and industrial crash are two sides of the same coin. Any debtor crisis shows how this works in practice. Nevertheless, the misery is made by man in and through their capitalistically organized relations of social reproduction. Marx's statement that the working class can only liberate itself poses the real problem of revolution. The problem is that of the self-organization of labor, a self-organization that poses a real alternative to capitalism and thus reflects the ends of the revolutionary struggle in its organizational means. In short, the great problem of revolutionary organization is that of finding a means or method of struggle that is worthy of man and which at the same time is able to withstand not just the most heavily armed reaction, but importantly, the mimicry of power in everyday life practice. I like that. I'm reading that again. The problem is that of the self-organization of labor, a self-organization that poses a real alternative to capitalism and thus reflects the ends of the revolutionary struggle in its organizational means. In short, the great problem of revolutionary organization is that of finding a means or method of struggle that is worthy of man and which at the same time is able to withstand not just the most heavily armed reaction, but importantly, the mimicry of power in everyday life practice. The first principle of revolutionary transformation is the democratization of society. That is, human self-determination against all forms of power which condemn man as a mere resource, restoring the human world to man himself. The democratization of society means essentially the democratic organization of socially necessary labor. That is, the organization of the realm of necessity by the associated producers themselves. The democratization of society and the democratic organization of necessary labor belong together as each other's presupposition. The democratization of necessary labor in freedom from coercion entails the demand for social autonomy in all areas of human life. Autonomy means human sovereignty and thus human dignity as a subject. It means the abolition of all relations which render man a debased being ruled by abstractions. Social autonomy, in short, means social self-determination in and through organizational forms of resistance which anticipate in their method of organization the purpose of revolution, human emancipation. Quote, the society of the free and equal, end quote, entails the end of class, a classless society where a man recognizes and organizes his, quote, forces propres, end quote, as his own social forces. The issue, then, that we confront is that of achieving power without taking power. Its resolution is not a theoretical question, it is a practical question.